Hello, today I'm going to read chapter 18 of Freddy Goes Camping by Walter R. Brooks, and this is chapter 18. The campers were at breakfast, and Freddy and Jinx joined them. Georgie had finished and gone for a swim in the lake. "I warned him he ought to swim on a full stomach," said Miss Minerva, "but he rather impertinent to me, so I didn't insist." Mr. Camper laughed. "What Georgie said was that it depended on what your stomach was full of. He said he realized that with 6 of Aunt's flapjacks inside him, he'd probably sink before he took 2 strokes. But he'd take one of the cork canoe cushions to hold him up. He was just trying to be funny, Aunt." "I wasn't angry," she said. "What's bothering me is these wraps. There's one on the edge of your plate now, Freddy." "Oh, don't worry about him," Freddy said. "He's come to help us. Hello, Jake. You missed a lot of excitement last night." "That doesn't bother me," said the wasp. "I can always stir up a little of my own if I feel the need of it. Where's this guy you want punctured?" "He's up at that hotel. Big red-faced man, you can't miss him. I think you and the boys better go bother him a little. You know our plan, but don't sink him yet. We're saving that for later." At 8:30, the plumbers and carpenters came back, and after that there was so much hammering and sawing and banging on the pipes that Freddy knew Mr. Anderson wouldn't get much sleep. But what about the DDT? They could put his car out of commission so he couldn't drive to town for it himself. But he'd only ask the carpenters to bring him a bottle of it. It was Miss Minerva who solved that problem. And when, at 11 o'clock, the mice reported that Mr. Anderson had started for Centerboro, she said, "You leave it to me. Jimson, I'll need your help. Come along." And they started down to Lakeside. When Mr. Anderson came back an hour or so later, he got out of his car to find Miss Minerva laying on the floor on the porch steps, groaning. "Well, ma'am, what are you doing here?" he asked very unsympathetically. Oh dear, Miss Minerva moaned. "It's my ankle. I fell off the porch. I called and called, but the workmen were all inside eating their lunch, and they didn't hear me." "I guess you didn't call very loud," said Mr. Anderson. "Well, what do you want me to do?" "Want you to do?" she snapped. "I want you to pick me up, help me back to camp. What sort of man are you, when you see a lady in trouble, to stand there and ask questions?" "I'm a very busy man," he replied. "You had no business on my porch in the first place. I'll send one of the men for your nephew." Miss Minerva didn't want that at all. "You'll help me yourself now," she said, "or I'll sue you for damages. This porch is unsafe, and I can prove it." It probably occurred to Mr. Anderson that to have to defend a lawsuit against a former guest wasn't the best way to open a hotel season. "Very well," he said grudgingly, and put down the packages on the porch. Mr. Camper, hiding behind the bush, watched them start up the path. Mr. Anderson's arm was about Miss Minerva's waist, and hers was about his neck as she hobbled along, leaning heavily on him. "Looks like Lover's Lane," said Mr. Camper sentimentally. Then, as they disappeared, he came out, picked up the bottle of DDT, and poured the contents out on the ground, after which he took it down and filled it back with lake water. Mr. Anderson came back a little later. He carried the bottle into the hotel. The hourly reports from the mice were as follows. 1 o'clock. Mr. Anderson sprang the room. 2 o'clock. After giving the carpenter some instructions, Mr. Anderson lay down for a nap, but was disturbed by wasps, which kept zooming down at him from the ceiling, then flying away before he could swat them. 3 o'clock. Mr. Anderson, still awake, tried to smoke, but cigarettes had chewed holes in the side of the cigars, so they wouldn't work. 4 o'clock. A Mr. and Mrs. Oedipus came from Centerbo to take the place of John Esses. Mr. Anderson told them what they were expected to do, then went for a walk in the woods. We have now lost contact with the enemy. So Fred sent the Wasp to reconnoiter, and presently they came back to report that Mr. Anderson was lying down asleep under a tree. Shall we poke him up a little? Jacob asked. You save your strings till he's so sound asleep. We can't wake him up any other way. Georgie, where are those squirrels who were around begging for corn flapjacks this morning? Get hold of them, will you? And so Georgie rounded up the squirrels, and Freddy made a deal with them. They took some small stones in their cheek pouches, and went up in the tree under Mr. Anderson as usual. Under tree which Mr. Anderson was asleep, with his mouth open as usual. They got on a branch right over his head and tried to drop the stones in his mouth. The squirrels are pretty good at this. The first 2 stones hit Mr. Anderson's chest, but they only made him grumble a little, but the third one was a bullseye. He gave a gulp and started up with a glare wildly around and wonder what it was that he had swallowed, and that he could still feeling going down. When he looked up and saw the squirrels, he yelled at them and shook his fist. But the squirrels just think that kind of thing is funny, and they chattered back mockingly. So he got up early and went in search of another tree. The squirrels followed him. After about an hour of Mr. Anderson went back to the hotel. The workmen had gone, and the mice reported at 6 o'clock that Miss Dediquette was cooking dinner. At 7, Mr. Anderson went to bed, giving the Oedipuses strict orders that he was not to be disturbed. At 7:05, the crickets tuned up. Jinx kept watch again that night. I wouldn't miss it for 8 pounds of prime catnip and 2 quarts of cream, he said. I haven't had so much fun since Miss Wiggins fell out of the swing. The others went to bed, but about 1 in the morning, Jinx waked them up. Anderson just came out and got in his car and drove up. He's probably going home to Centerbo to get a good night's sleep in his own bed. Good gracious, that'll spoil all the good work we've done. Said Freddy. How about the Oedipuses? Oh, they weren't as tough as the John S's. They left at midnight. Mr. Camphor crawled out of his sleeping bag. I know what we can do, he said. Come on, Freddy, Aunt Minerva. You build up the fire. Big, so it looks like a house is burning up from off Centerbo way. Without explaining further, he ran down, and he and Freddy got into the canoe and paddled across his house. We don't really need to hurry, he said. It'll take Anderson half an hour to get home, and we'll allow about 20 minutes more for him to get to bed and asleep before we phone. It'll make him madder if we wake him up than if we catch him just as he gets in. They went up to the house and roused Bannister, and Mr. Camphor gave him his instructions. Then, when they figured Mr. Anderson had had time to get to bed, Bannister phoned. He had to ring about 20 minutes, but at last Mr. Anderson answered. Sorry to bother you, sir, said Bannister. This is Mr. Camphor's butler up at the lake. There's a fine big fire over the North Shore. It looks like a house is burning. I understand you brought Lakeside, and I thought, oh, no, sir. I've never seen a campfire as big as that, and Mr. Camphor and his friend should be asleep at this hour. I can't see, sir. Mr. Camphor has our telescope with him. It's right in the direction of Lakeside. No, sir. I can't call the fire department. I thought I should call you first. Yes, sir. I thank you, sir. And Bannister hung up. Well, Bannister, thanks, said Mr. Camphor. We'll have to get back. Anything new? No, sir. Miss Elmira got off safely this morning. Very quiet day, sir. Very pleasant. Good. Come along, Freddy. Miss Minerva had certainly built up a real fire. The flames leaped the tree-top height, and the glare must have been visible for miles. The canoe was almost back to camp when Freddy heard the distant and faint wail of a siren. They'll have seen the glow by this time, said Mr. Camphor as they beached the canoe. Well, let's pull it apart a little and get into our bags. 10 minutes later, when the fire truck came roaring and shrieking and bounding down the rough road and pulled up behind the hotel, the fire had sunk down. Everyone in camp was apparently asleep. Everyone except Freddy and Jinx, who had circled around the woods back of the hotel and were hiding behind a shed near the end of the road. The firemen piled off the truck, whose searchlight was playing over the front of the building. Then Mr. Anderson drove up behind them, and they surrounded him in an angry group and demanded to know why they had been pulled out of bed when there wasn't any fire. You saw it yourself, he protested. The sky was all red. There was plenty of argument back and forth, and the fireman called Mr. Anderson a lot of names and piled on the truck and drove roaring and shrieking and bounding home. As soon as Mr. Anderson went indoors, Freddy came out of hiding. Very cautiously, he lifted the hood of the car, disconnected all the wires he could reach, unscrewed everything unscrewable, and loosened everything loosable, and then went back to camp. And that is the end of chapter 18. So, this was Georgie floating on the pillow, and then the squirrels are throwing stones in Mr. Anderson's mouth, and then that is the end. Bye-bye.